The morning Hazel Barrett rode into Dusk Creek with a land claim folded into the pocket of her black morning dress. Every soul on that main street stopped what they were doing and stared, because no woman who had lost as much as she had possessed any right to look that determined. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains were blooming in their deceptive way, wildflowers pushing through cracked earth, promising things they could not always deliver. Hazel was 29 years old, brown-haired and green-eyed, with the kind of quiet strength that only comes from surviving something that was meant to break a person entirely. Her husband, Thomas Barrett, had died of a fever the previous November, leaving her with a mule named Clarence, a wagon full of everything she owned in the world, and a stubbornness that his mother had always said was Hazel's finest and most troublesome quality. The land she had filed on was called the Drover's Hollow Parcel. 40 acres of it sat along a dry creek bed that the old-timers in town swore came alive with water twice a year, and the remaining 60 acres stretched up a shallow rise into grass that, if managed right, could feed a modest herd through summer. There was a well on the property hand-dug and lined with limestone that had not gone dry even in the drought year of 1874. There was also the remains of a cabin, 3 walls still standing, the 4th collapsed inward from some unnamed violence or simply from the indifference of time. And there was the reputation. 3 families had tried the Drover's Hollow Parcel before Hazel. The first had lost a child to a rattler in the first month. The second had watched their barn burn in a lightning storm that left every other farm in the county untouched. The third family, the Pruitts, had packed up and left in the dead of winter without telling anyone why, and when the Dusk Creek sheriff rode out to check on them the following spring, he found their dishes still on the table and a half-eaten loaf of bread gone to green mold on the counter. People added their own details to the story over time, as people do, until the land itself seemed to breathe with malevolent intention. Hazel did not believe in curses. She believed in soil composition and water access, and the angle at which a building faced the wind. She had been the daughter of a farmer before she was the wife of one, and she knew that land did not choose its victims any more than weather chose its storms. Things happened. People assigned meaning to them afterward because meaning was more bearable than accident. She filed her claim at the land office on a Thursday, paid the required fees, and set out for the hollow the following morning before the town had properly woken. She did not want an audience for what she suspected would be an unglamorous arrival. Patrick Warren heard about the widow and the cursed land before noon that same Thursday. He was at the feed store, loading sacks of grain into his wagon, when old Clarence Hobbs, confusingly, a man with the same name as Hazel's mule, leaned against a post and announced it to anyone within earshot. Patrick was 33 years old, a cattle rancher who spread, the Double Creek Ranch, bordered the Drover's Hollow Parcel on its eastern edge. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders and long in the leg, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that his late mother had called honest, which he took to mean they revealed more than he intended them to. He had been working his ranch alone for 2 years, since his partner and oldest friend, Gil Marsh, had sold his half and moved his family to Colorado. Patrick employed 2 hands, a young man named Reuben who was 20 and eager, and an older fellow named Creed who spoke rarely but worked without complaint from sunup to past dark. The ranch was productive enough. Patrick was not wealthy, but he was comfortable, which in Kansas in 1878 counted for a great deal. His immediate reaction to the news about the widow and the hollow was something practical and geographic. That land abutted his eastern fence line. If someone was going to work it, he needed to know who, and whether they understood the fencing arrangements that had been in place since before the Pruitts tried the place. His second reaction, which arrived a few seconds after the first and surprised him, was concern. The hollow had problems that had nothing to do with curses and everything to do with geography and a man named Silas Droke. Silas Droke owned the grazing rights to the creek bed that ran through the hollow, or claimed to, based on a handshake arrangement with the county commissioner that had never been formally recorded. He was a bad-tempered man with legitimate land holdings east of Patrick's ranch and illegitimate ambitions regarding everything in between. He had driven off the Pruitts himself, though nobody in Dusk Creek said so openly. He had done it with a combination of legal harassment, fencing disputes, and one incident involving a dead cow left on their porch that the sheriff had diplomatically described as impossible to attribute. A widow working alone on that claim was going to find herself in Silas Droke's crosshairs before the first week was out. Patrick finished loading his grain, paid for it, and stood in the street for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands the way he did when he was working through a problem. He told himself he was going to ride out to the hollow to talk about the fence line. He told himself that was the only reason. He climbed into his wagon and pointed his horse east toward town first, because he wanted to stop at the land office and confirm that the claim had actually been filed correctly, that the widow had protected herself legally in all the ways the hollow's particular geography demanded. The clerk at the land office was a thin, nervous man named Alderton who patted his bald head when he was anxious. He patted it considerably when Patrick asked about the Barrett claim. She filed everything in proper order, Alderton said, patting, paid her fees, registered the water access provisions correctly, which I will say is more than the Pruitts managed because they never filed the creek access separately and that was part of their difficulty. She filed the creek access separately, Patrick said. She did. Asked me specifically about it actually. She knew to ask. Alderton blinked. Knew more about the process than most men I see in here, if I am being honest. Patrick nodded, settled his hat back onto his head, and rode east out of Dusk Creek toward the drover's hollow parcel, telling himself again that it was the fence line. Only the fence line. He smelled wood smoke before he could see the cabin clearly, which meant she had already gotten a fire going, which meant she had already cleared the collapsed fourth wall or worked around it, which meant she had been working since before dawn. He followed the track that ran between two old cottonwoods that marked the entrance to the hollow, and came around a stand of scrub cedar to find the wagon parked sensibly close to the well. The mule, a large, gray-brown animal with deeply skeptical eyes, tied to a post that had been freshly driven into the ground that morning, and Hazel Barrett standing on the roof of the three-walled cabin with a hammer in her hand, nailing down the framework for what was going to be a new fourth wall. She heard his horse and looked down at him without fear or surprise, which was the first thing he noticed about her. She simply looked assessed and said nothing while she drove the nail she had been holding before the interruption cleanly home. That framework is going to put your door facing north, Patrick said, because he could not help it. She looked at the framework, then at the direction of the prevailing wind, then back at him. She did not thank him. Instead, she said, "The other three walls are already set and they are solid. I am not tearing them down to reorient the building. The winter wind comes from the northwest here in the hollow. You will feel it through that door frame worse than the rest of the county. Then I will build a good door," she said, and went back to nailing. He sat on his horse for a moment, caught between admiration and frustration, and then swung down from the saddle. "Patrick Warren," he said, "I own the Double Creek Ranch on your eastern border." She looked down at him again. "I know who you are. You were pointed out to me at the land office. Alderton said you would probably come by. He said that. He said, and I am quoting directly, 'The Warren fellow will almost certainly ride over.' He is not unfriendly, but he is territorial about that eastern fence line, and he will want to talk about it." She came down from the roof then, using a ladder made from two long branches and cross-braced sticks that she had clearly built herself that morning. She was not as tall as he had expected. She was also not as fragile as the word widow tended to suggest. There was a quality to her that was entirely solid, like the limestone lining her well. "Hazel Barrett," she said, and held out a hand that was already calloused from the morning's work. He shook it. "About the fence line, your fence is on your property," she said. I checked the survey stakes this morning. We share 60 yards of common border along the eastern ridge. The fence posts there are solid, but two of the boards need replacing. I was going to replace them from my side next week as a courtesy, since the gap benefits your livestock more than mine at present. He stared at her. You already checked the survey stakes. First thing I did after I found the well. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating everything he had come here prepared to say. All right, he said. The fence is not why I came. She set her hammer down on a flat rock and looked at him directly, and he felt those green eyes find something in him he had not known was visible. Sila's droke, she said. Yes. Tell me everything, she said, and walked to her fire, where a tin coffee pot sat on a flat stone. She poured 2 cups without asking if he wanted one, handed one to him, and sat down on an overturned crate with the posture of someone who was listening carefully and would not forget a word. He told her everything. He told her about the grazing rights claim, which Droke would use as a legal pressure point regardless of whether it held up in court, because legal proceedings took time and money and wore people down. He told her about the dead cow on the Prout porch, though he said it carefully, noting that it was unproven attribution. He told her about Droke's habit of fencing off access roads when he believed he could intimidate someone into abandoning a claim, which was a violation of county ordinance but required a complaint to the sheriff to pursue. And the Dust Creek sheriff, a man named Ott, was not entirely unsympathetic to Droke's political connections at the county level. Hazel listened to all of it with her coffee cup held in both hands, the steam rising into the cool morning air, her expression neither frightened nor dismissive but instead careful and precise. When he finished, she said, "Is his grazing rights claim actually filed anywhere?" "Not formally recorded." Alderton confirmed that. "Then it is not a legal claim, it is a social pressure campaign." "That is one way to put it. It is the accurate way to put it," she said, "and social pressure campaigns require isolation to be effective. They work best when the target is alone and unknown and has no allies in the community." "That is true. Then I need to not be isolated and unknown," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment in the morning light, with her 3-walled cabin behind her and the limestone well beside her and 40 miles of Kansas prairie stretching out in every direction, and he said, "That is a reasonable strategy. But it requires people to know you and be willing to stand with you, and that takes time. How much time do you think I have before Droke makes a move? Honestly, 2 weeks, maybe 3. He will want to rattle you before you get settled." She nodded slowly. "Then we had better work quickly," she said, and stood up and picked up her hammer again, and Patrick Warren realized, in a way that was entirely quiet and somewhat alarming, that he had arrived here planning to warn her and was instead being subtly recruited. He was back the next morning with Reuben and Creed. He told himself later that it was practical. He needed the goodwill of his eastern neighbor. He needed the drover's hollow parcel worked by someone competent who would not let disputes fester into the kind of range wars that disrupted everyone's livelihood. These were true things, as far as they went. They did not fully explain why he had spent the previous evening in his bunkhouse thinking about green eyes and the particular set of a jaw that suggested someone who had decided what they were and would not be argued out of it. Reuben arrived enthusiastic, as he always did, ready to frame walls and be useful in the loudly cheerful way of young men who have not yet learned that work is better done quietly. Creed arrived and immediately began assessing the collapsed wall and the condition of the remaining 3, communicating his assessment through a series of slow nods and one short sentence. "Roof is sound." Hazel had already been at work for an hour. She had leveled the floor inside the cabin using dirt she had excavated from a low spot behind the building and distributed with a precision that impressed Patrick despite himself. She had organized her supplies along the standing north wall with a system that made efficient use of the space. In a way, he recognized as someone who had thought carefully about small space living. She greeted all three of them with the same directness she had given Patrick the day before, assigning tasks with a naturalness that did not read as bossiness but as clarity, which was different and considerably more rare. She put Creed on the wall frame, which was the correct choice since Creed had built 3 structures on Patrick's ranch and knew what he was doing. She put Reuben on clearing debris from the area around the well, which burned his energy productively and kept his enthusiasm from interfering with the precise work. She put Patrick on repairing the fence section she had identified the previous day, handing him the correct nails and boards already cut to length before he could ask where anything was. "You measured all of this last night?" he asked. "I measured it yesterday afternoon," she said, "after you left. You did not take any time to just sit." She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile but had the shape of one. "Sitting does not build walls, Mr. Warren." "Patrick," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Patrick," she said, and went to help Creed. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. The fourth wall of the cabin took shape under Creed's methodical direction and Hazel's willing assistance, and by 2 o'clock it was framed and half-boarded. Patrick finished the fence repairs and came back to find Reuben, in a burst of initiative, attempting to clear a section of tall grass near the cabin without fully appreciating that tall grass sometimes contained things that objected to being disturbed. He had found a prairie dog colony and was now standing very still while he reconsidered his approach. "Move downwind and go around," Patrick told him. "Yes, sir," said Reuben, moving downwind and going around. Hazel appeared at Patrick's shoulder. "He is a good worker," she said, watching Reuben navigate diplomatically around the prairie dogs. "Young but good." "He is," Patrick agreed. "He reminds me of myself at that age, which is either a recommendation or a warning, depending." She glanced at him sideways. The almost smile was back. "Which do you think it is?" "Probably both." She laughed at that, a genuine laugh, short and warm, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and the sound of it did something to the afternoon air that made it feel different from the moment before it. They ate dinner around the fire that evening, all 4 of them, because Hazel had put a pot of beans on at noon and added salt pork and dried onions at midday, and the result was better than anything Patrick had eaten at his own table in longer than he wanted to admit. She had also produced a pan of cornbread that she had made in a cast iron skillet over the coals with the ease of long practice, and the 4 of them sat on crates and rocks and ate in the comfortable silence of people who have worked hard together, with Reuben occasionally saying something cheerful that no one entirely responded to and Creed nodding at intervals that had no clear conversational connection to anything. When Reuben and Creed had gone to water and tether the horses for the night before making the ride back to the Double Creek, Patrick found himself still seated, coffee cup in hand, watching the fire with Hazel across it. "You did not have to bring them," she said. "I know. But I am glad you did," she said, and it was clearly something that cost her a small amount to say because she was not the sort of person who admitted gladness easily. He could see that. He respected it. "I will be back tomorrow," he said, "and the day after. Until the roof is properly weathered and the cabin is sealed and you have had a chance to introduce yourself to enough of the county that Droke cannot pretend you do not exist." She looked at him across the fire. "Why?" It was a fair question, and he was quiet with it for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Because what he did to the Prutes was wrong," he said finally. "And because the land office clerk told me you knew to file the creek access separately, and there are not many people who would know that, and the hollow deserves someone competent working it." She watched him for a moment in a way that suggested she was deciding something. "Those are good reasons," she said. "Are they the only ones?" He looked at her across the fire and did not answer immediately, and the silence between them stretched into something that was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of answer. "Good night, Hazel," he said, and stood and went to find his horse. The following 2 weeks were the hardest and most alive Patrick Warren had felt in years. He rearranged his schedule at the Double Creek so that he and at least one of his hands could spend meaningful time at the hollow each day. He justified this to himself on the first morning, and by the third morning he had stopped bothering with justifications and was simply going. Creed had finished the fourth wall, and they had all turned their attention to the roof, which needed new shingles in 4 sections, and a patch of fresh sod at the northeast corner where the original had rotted through. Hazel worked alongside them without the self-consciousness of someone who felt she should not be doing physical labor, because she did not feel that. She had been farming since she was 8 years old. She told him about Thomas in small pieces over the course of those 2 weeks, not in any organized way, but in the way things surface when you are busy with your hands, and your guard is not fully assembled. Thomas had been a good man, she said once, handing up a bundle of shingles to where Patrick was kneeling on the roof. He had been patient and careful and loved her genuinely, and she missed him in the specific, practical way of a person who had relied on someone, and then found them gone not dramatically, but in the 1,000 small daily places where someone used to be. He wanted this land, she said on another afternoon, when they were working on the well cover. Not this exact parcel, but this kind of thing, his own land, his own claim. He died the November before the spring lottery would have let him enter. So you filed for him, Patrick said. She considered this. I filed for both of us, she said. And for me, I needed somewhere to go that was mine. I grew up on my father's land, and then I lived on Thomas's family's lease, and I never had something that was just my own decision. Patrick understood this in a way he could not fully articulate. He had built the Double Creek on his own decision, on his own labor and savings and stubbornness, and the particular satisfaction of that of standing on something you had made was not something he could explain to someone who had never been denied it. It is a good decision, he said. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said, it is. Silas Droke appeared at the end of the second week, on a Tuesday afternoon when the new cabin wall was finished and the roof was sealed, and Hazel had just spent 3 days turning over the best section of ground for a kitchen garden. He came with 2 men Patrick recognized as ranch hands, broad-shouldered and expression-free in the manner of men who were paid to be present rather than to think. He was a heavy man, Droke, with a face that had been ruined in pieces over the years by weather and bad temper. He rode up to where Hazel was washing her hands at the well and stopped his horse close enough to be rude about it, the horse's flank nearly brushing her shoulder. Hazel stepped back 1 step, looked up at him, and said nothing. She was very good at silence used as a position. Mrs. Barrett, Droke said, I heard you filed on this parcel. You heard correctly, she said. I want you to know that I have a grazing arrangement on the creek bed that goes back 11 years. I want you to know, she said calmly, that I inquired specifically about that arrangement at the land office, and it has never been formally recorded. A grazing arrangement that is not recorded carries no legal weight against a filed homestead claim. I had a letter to this effect from the county commissioner's office before I filed. Droke's jaw tightened. Behind him, his 2 men shifted slightly on their horses. The commissioner is a personal friend of mine. I would encourage you to speak with him again, Hazel said pleasantly, because the letter I have is signed by him and is on file with my claim documentation. I would be happy to show it to you, though I imagine his office would have a copy as well. She had done this before Patrick arrived. She had obtained this letter before she had even come to Dusk Creek. He had pulled his horse up at the edge of the hollow just in time to hear the exchange, and he sat very still on his horse, watching, holding his presence in reserve because he could see that she did not need him and would want the chance to hold this position on her own. Droke stared at her for a long moment. This land is not good for you, he said, and it landed somewhere between a statement and something else. I think that is my determination to make, she said. 3 families have tried and left, she said. I am aware. I am not them. Droke looked at her for another long moment, turned his horse, and rode back toward the cottonwoods at the entrance to the hollow. He had gone 20 yards when Patrick walked his horse forward at an angle that brought him across Droke's path, not blocking but visible, which was the point. "Silas," Patrick said. Droke looked at him with the particular expression of someone recalculating. "Warren." "Good afternoon," Patrick said, with perfect pleasantness, and moved his horse aside and let Droke pass. When Droke and his men had cleared the cottonwoods, Patrick rode over to where Hazel was standing at the well and found her hands very slightly trembling, which she stilled by pressing them flat against the stone coping. "You were there the whole time," she said. "I was waiting to see if you needed me," he said. She looked up at him, and something in her face was less than entirely composed for the first time he had seen it. "You knew I would handle it." "I did," he said. "I was there in case it went a different direction. In case his men, yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her own hands on the stone. "Thank you," she said, "for both things, for knowing I could handle it and for being there anyway." He swung down from his horse and came to stand beside her at the well, and they looked out together across the turned earth of the kitchen garden, and the repaired fence line and the new fourth wall of the cabin that was drying in the afternoon sun, and the whole of the hollow looked, for the first time since Patrick had known it, like a place someone had chosen to be rather than a place they had ended up. "You need to go into Dusk Creek," he said. "You need people to see you there regularly." "I want to take you to the church social on Saturday." She looked at him sideways. "The church social. It is where everyone goes. You need to meet the Hendersons, who have 300 acres north of here and whose good word is worth more than any legal document in the county. You need to meet Pastor Vance, who talks to everyone. And you need to be seen with someone people know, so that you are not just the widow at the hollow, but a person with a name and a community." "And you are the someone people know," she said. "I am well enough known," he said. She considered him for a moment with those green eyes that found more than he intended them to. "Is this another practical reason, Patrick?" He met her gaze. "I would like to take you to the church social, Hazel," he said simply. "For every reason I have said, and also because I would like to spend a Saturday evening in your company. Both things are true at once." The silence that followed was different from previous silences. It had weight and warmth. "All right," she said. "Saturday." The Dusk Creek Church social on Saturday evening in late May was a considerable affair, because the community's social calendar was sparse enough that every event on it was attended by nearly everyone within riding distance. Tables were set up on the grass beside the church, and women brought covered dishes, and the Henderson boy played a fiddle with more enthusiasm than precision, and children ran in the gathering dusk while their parents stood in clusters and talked about weather and livestock and the price of grain, which was the conversation that mattered most to most of them. Hazel wore a dark green dress that was not her morning dress, which Patrick understood was a decision that had required something from her. She arrived with him in his wagon, having come up to the Double Creek that afternoon at his invitation, and he had watched her come around the side of his barn and feel the particular strangeness of arriving at someone else's place for the first time. He introduced her to the Hendersons within 5 minutes, because that was the primary purpose of the evening, and he was practical about purpose. Frank Henderson was 60 years old and had the handshake of a man who had worked his land since before Patrick's father was born, and his wife, Mabel, was the kind of woman who organized things, including opinions, and whose acceptance of a new person in the community had a filtering effect on everyone else's. Mabel looked at Hazel for about 30 seconds and then asked her directly what her plan was for the hollow's soil, and Hazel answered directly and in considerable agricultural detail, and Mabel Henderson nodded twice in the deliberate way of someone revising an estimate upward. "She is going to be fine," Mabel told her husband, not quietly enough for this to be private, and Frank Henderson laughed and shook Patrick's hand again as if congratulating him for something Patrick had not done. Patrick noticed that Hazel registered this exchange, the handshake, the implication in it, and looked away with a particular careful expression. He wanted to say something to address it but did not know yet what the right thing was, So he held it and they moved on to meet Pastor Vance, who was delighted by Hazel and immediately invited her to Sunday service. And the Caldwell family, who farmed south of the hollow and whose water access overlapped with hers, in a way that they quickly determined was complementary rather than competitive. By the end of the evening, Hazel had spoken to 36 people and been spoken well of by at least a dozen of those in Patrick's hearing. She ate a plate of food with genuine appreciation and listened to the fiddle with her head slightly tilted in the way she had when something interested her. And she talked to Patrick's neighbor Reuben's mother, who was a tiny, fierce woman named Ada, for 20 minutes about kitchen gardens and which varieties of bean did well in the specific alkaline soil of that part of the county. On the wagon ride back to the hollow in the dark, the stars enormous above the flat Kansas plain, she said, "You planned that very carefully." "I planned which people I needed to introduce you to," he said. "What happened after the introductions was entirely you." She turned to look at him on the wagon seat. The moonlight was bright enough to see by. "You are very thoughtful," she said. "You plan things." "I do," he said. "Does that bother you?" "No," she said. "I plan things too. I just wanted you to know that I see it." He thought about that. "What else do you see?" he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. She was quiet for a moment with the sound of the horses' hooves on the dry ground and the creak of the wagon and the enormous night all around them. "I see someone who came to warn me and stayed to help," she said. "I see someone who knew when to hold back and when to step forward. I see someone who is lonely in a way that has become comfortable enough that he might not have noticed it yet." He said nothing for a moment. The wagon rolled on through the dark. "That last part might be accurate," he said. "I thought it might be," she said, and turned to look at the road ahead, and he watched her profile against the starlight and knew that something in him had shifted irrevocably, the way the creek bed shifted in the spring floods, not breaking, but moving permanently into a new channel. He stopped the wagon at the entrance to the hollow by the 2 old cottonwoods, and she climbed down and took the lantern she had brought, and she looked up at him in the wagon with the lantern's glow warm on her face. "Good night, Patrick," she said. "Good night," he said, and sat with the reins in his hands watching the glow of her lantern move through the dark toward the cabin until it disappeared inside. And then he sat there another moment in the full silence of the Kansas night, which was not silent at all but full of crickets and wind and the enormous breathing of the plains. And he thought that he was a man who had spent 2 years being productively lonely, and that this was apparently over. June arrived with heat and the beginning of real work on Hazel's land. She had laid out her kitchen garden with precision, spacing her rows according to the water available from the well and the morning shadow cast by the cabin, which Patrick discovered she had calculated before she had even arrived. She planted beans and squash and late corn and turnips and sweet potatoes, and she tended them with the focused attention of someone who understood that this winter's food was in this spring's dirt. Patrick helped her build a small chicken coop from lumber she had purchased on credit at the Dust Creek General Store, negotiating the credit terms with the store's owner, a Mr. Pruitt, in a conversation Patrick was not present for but heard about afterward from 3 separate people, all of whom described Hazel as having been extremely reasonable and left Pruitt feeling that the terms had been his own idea. She brought 4 laying hens back from Dust Creek in the wagon, and the chickens installed themselves in the coop with the philosophical resignation of chickens everywhere. Patrick noticed, during this time, that Hazel never asked for help she did not need. She was extraordinarily particular about this. She would work alongside him on things that required 2 people without self-consciousness or false pride, but she would not accept assistance with things she could manage alone, and she was clear about the distinction. He found this, after an initial adjustment period in which his instinct to assist had been gently declined twice, to be deeply restful. There was no performance in her, no calculation of how she appeared, no management of other people's perception of her helplessness or her strength. She simply was what she was, and what she was very capable, and she knew it, and that was that. What she allowed him, increasingly, was company. He began to stay later in the evenings, the two of them sitting by the fire after the work was done, talking in the comfortable, overlapping way of people who are discovering that they think about things similarly enough to find each other genuinely interesting. She had opinions about everything about county politics and soil science, and the injustice of the homestead, Act's practical limitations, which favored men with capital over women and families without it. A disparity she described with a precise anger that was not bitter, but was clear-eyed in a way that made Patrick think about things he had not previously been required to examine. Thomas could have filed this claim the previous year, she said one evening. We had the money and the standing, but I could not file it in my own name without his signature until he died, and by then he could not sign anything. She paused. The law wrote women out of it, out of their own futures, out of the right to plant their own gardens. That is wrong, Patrick said. It is, she said, and I am not going to be written out of it. She looked at the fire. I want my name on this land not because Thomas cannot have it, but because I earned it and it is mine to earn. Your name is on it, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He reached across and found her hand on the arm of the crate she was sitting on, and he took it, and she did not pull it back. They sat like that for a while with the fire between them and the enormous sky above and the whole of the hollow quiet around them, and it was one of those moments that Patrick would remember for the rest of his life, not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because it was so entirely right. 3 weeks into June, Silas Droke made his second move. He filed a complaint with the county regarding the water access to the creek bed, claiming that Hazel's claim documentation did not properly account for the seasonal flow changes that affected his grazing land downstream. It was a carefully constructed piece of legal harassment that required a response within 30 days, or it would go to hearing by default. Hazel read the complaint at her kitchen table. She had a table now, rough cut but solid, that Patrick and Creed had built in an afternoon with the same expression she had worn during the Droke confrontation. Careful, precise, unmoved. I need to go to the county seat, she said. Ellsworth, Patrick said. Yes. I will drive you. You do not have to, Hazel. He said it quietly and she stopped. He met her eyes. I want to drive you, let me want to drive you. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her face did that thing it sometimes did, where the careful precision softened briefly into something more open. All right, she said. Thursday. The ride to Ellsworth was 40 miles, which meant an overnight stay, which they arranged with perfect propriety. Hazel at the Ellsworth Hotel and Patrick at the boarding house 2 streets over, because she had a reputation to maintain on her claim, and he understood that entirely. But the 40 miles of wagon road through the Kansas morning gave them 6 hours in each other's company with nothing to do but talk, and they used all of it. She told him about her childhood on her father's farm in Missouri, about the particular quality of the light in autumn there, about learning to read by oil lamp after the farm work was done because her father believed, with great conviction and in deliberate defiance of prevailing opinion, that a girl's education was as important as a boy's. She had read everything in the county lending library twice before she turned 16. She told him about meeting Thomas at a county fair, about the particular combination of kindness and humor that had made her trust him almost immediately, about the grief of watching fever take him so quickly in November when she had thought they had decades still ahead. He told her about building the Double Creek from nothing, about the 2 years he had spent working as a ranch hand to save money before he could buy his first 40 acres, about Gil Marsh, who had been his partner and friend, and whose absence he had adjusted to but not fully healed from, about the particular silence of a well-built ranch that runs smoothly and provides everything material that a person needs and leaves one nevertheless aware of what is not there. What is not there? She asked. He looked at the road ahead. Someone to tell about the day, he said. She was quiet for a moment beside him on the wagon seat. Yes, she said, that is exactly it. At the county seat, they met with the land commissioner's assistant, a young woman named Miss Dolly who was brisk and efficient, and produced the counter documentation Hazel needed with a speed that suggested Droke had tried this approach before with other claimants. Hazel filed a formal response to the complaint and a supplementary affidavit that addressed the specific water flow provision with such technical precision that Miss Dolly looked up from the paperwork and said, "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father taught me to read everything carefully," Hazel said, "and I read everything relating to my claim 3 times before I filed it." On the drive home the following morning, with the complaint properly addressed and the documentation filed, Hazel sat beside Patrick on the wagon with an easy confidence that was different from the careful precision she usually carried, and she laughed at something he said about the boarding house breakfast being entirely misrepresented by its smell. And he thought that this specifically, this warm, laughing morning on a Kansas road, was something he wanted to be in for the rest of his life. He did not say this. It was too early and she had things yet to establish, and he was not a man who spoke before he was certain. But he thought it clearly, in a way that had nothing confused about it. July baked the hollow in the particular way of Kansas summers, the heat pressing down from a white sky that showed no sympathy for the ambitions of kitchen gardens. Hazel watered methodically, carrying buckets from the well to each row in the early morning, and again in the evening when the sun had dropped enough to make the water useful rather than evaporative. Her beans were coming in. Her squash had sprawled across half the garden with the enthusiastic imperiousness of squash everywhere. The sweet potatoes were underground and invisible and trusted. Patrick brought his cattle to graze on the eastern section of the hollow's upper acreage, which they had arranged as a formal grazing agreement. A real one, properly drafted by the county clerk, with Hazel receiving a modest payment in goods and services that they negotiated over 2 evenings with the seriousness of people who intended the arrangement to last. Reuben fell mildly in love with the hollow. He kept inventing reasons to come over, though Patrick suspected the primary reason was Ada, his mother, who had become fast friends with Hazel over the kitchen garden conversation at the social, and visited twice a week with such regularity that it had become an established feature of the hollow's life. Ada brought things. She brought extra seeds and advice about pickling and a jar of wild plum preserves and a pattern for a winter quilt. And in return, Hazel gave her the first real friendship she had offered anyone since coming to Dusk Creek, which Ada received with the happy fierceness of a woman who had been lonely in her particular way for a long time. One Thursday afternoon in late July, when the heat had reached the kind of absolute quality that makes time feel slow and full, Hazel found Patrick repairing the south side of her corral fence. She had purchased 2 young horses in June, a bay mare and a roan gelding, and brought him a cup of water from the well and sat down in the shade of the corral post and looked at him working. He knew she was watching and worked a little more carefully than he otherwise would have, which he was embarrassed to notice about himself. "Patrick," she said, "why has no one married you?" He laughed at the directness of it, which was very like her. "Several women have tried," he said. "I was not good at it when I was younger, too focused on the ranch, too sure that was enough. And now," she said. He drove a nail straight and turned to look at her. She was sitting with her back against the fence post in the shade, her hat in her lap, and the afternoon light on her face was the gold of late summer, and he thought about what he had thought on the road back from Ellsworth and knew that it had only become more true. "Now I know it is not enough," he said. She held his gaze, and there was nothing held back in her expression. "No," she said, "it is not." He set down the hammer. He came and sat beside her in the shade of the fence post, the 2 of them with their backs to the corral and the Kansas afternoon around them, and he took her hand the way he had by the fire in June, and she turned toward him, and he said, "I'm going to say something, and I want you to have time to think about it." "All right," she said. "I do not want to be your neighbor," he said. "I want to be more than your neighbor. I want to be the person you tell the day to, every day. I am in love with you, Hazel, and I know it is soon, And I know you have things here that are yours and yours alone, and I would never try to take that from you. And Patrick, she said. Yes. Stop explaining and say the rest of it, she said, with the almost smile that had become fully the smile by then. He looked at her. Will you marry me, he said, when you are ready, when the time is right for you. There is no hurry. I just want you to know that I am asking. She looked at him for a long moment in the gold afternoon light. I am ready, she said. I did not expect to be, and I thought I would need more time, but I know what I feel and I know that I trust you, and Thomas would have liked you very much, which matters to me. She paused. Yes, she said, I will marry you. He did not say anything immediately. He brought her hand up and held it with both of his, and he looked at her, and whatever was in his face was apparently enough, because she leaned forward and he leaned forward and they met in the middle, in the shade of the corral fence, with the bay mare watching over the top rail with magnificent indifference, and it was the gentlest and most certain thing he had ever experienced in his life. They married in September at the Dust Creek Church, on a morning when the first edge of autumn had arrived in the air, and the cottonwoods at the hollow's entrance had gone to gold. Pastor Vance performed the ceremony. Frank and Mabel Henderson were there, and Ada, and Reuben, who cried without apparent embarrassment, and Creed, who did not cry but shook Patrick's hand afterward with a grip that said everything Creed's words never did, and Miss Dolly from Ellsworth, who had written to congratulate Hazel on the resolution of the Droke complaint, and been surprised to receive an invitation in response, and had come anyway, bringing a practical wedding gift of a set of survey maps for the Hollow's expanded acreage. Hazel wore a cream dress she had made herself from fabric she had bought at Prewitt's store, and she had flowers in her hair that Ada had arranged that morning, wild sunflowers and prairie asters, and she looked like someone who had decided something and was at peace with the decision in the deepest possible way. Patrick wore his best coat and had cut his hair the previous day and shook hands with everyone who came, and felt, for the first time in his adult memory, that everything he had was in the same place. The question of where they would live was one they had discussed carefully over 2 evenings in August, with the seriousness and mutual respect that characterized how they approached everything together. Hazel's position was clear. She had worked her claim, she was working her claim, and she intended to continue working her claim, and she was not prepared to leave it. Patrick's position, which he arrived at quickly because he could see that it was correct, was that the Double Creek could be managed from the Hollow as easily as from the Double Creek itself, given that the two properties shared a fence line, and he could ride his eastern acreage within 20 minutes of leaving Hazel's door. They decided to live at the Hollow. They decided to keep the Double Creek's bunkhouse for Reuben and Creed, who would continue to manage the ranch's daily operations with Patrick's oversight from a slightly greater distance, and they decided to expand the Hollow's cabin to accommodate 2 people who both had opinions about where things should be kept. The expansion happened in the 2 weeks before the wedding, with Reuben and Creed and Frank Henderson's son David, who was 22, and apparently at loose ends. Patrick and Hazel had drawn up the plan together, arguing pleasantly about the size of the window in the east wall for the better part of an afternoon, before arriving at a compromise that was objectively better than either of their individual positions. The result was a cabin with a large main room and a proper bedroom and a porch facing south, which avoided the north wind coming through the original door, and also gave them a view of the Hollow's best grassland in the mornings. After the wedding and the dinner that the community had organized on the church grounds, an enormous spread of dishes that took 3 tables to hold, because Mabel Henderson had organized it, and Mabel Henderson did not do things by half, Patrick and Hazel drove back to the Hollow in the late afternoon, and she carried nothing bridal over any threshold, because she was not that kind of woman. But she stood on the new south porch and looked out at the Hollow in the early autumn light, and he stood beside her, and she took his hand and said, "It is good." "It is," he said. "We made it good," she said. "You started making it good before I arrived," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You arrived on the 2nd day," she said. He put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch of the Hollow's cabin in the September afternoon and looked at the gold cottonwoods and the limestone well and the kitchen garden going to seed at the end of the season, and the good grass of the upper acreage and the eastern fence line that had started all of this. And the whole of it was theirs, and it was real. The autumn of 1878 was the first autumn they spent building a life together, which is different from and more complex than building separately in proximity. They learned each other's rhythms. Patrick woke earlier. Hazel went to sleep later and was often still at the kitchen table when he rose, reading by oil lamp, making notes in a farm journal she kept with the same precision she applied to everything. He learned to move quietly in the early mornings and to bring coffee to her table without announcing himself, and she learned to value the way he moved through the world with a steady physical competence that solved problems before they were fully problems. And they were both learning the particular grammar of a shared life, which has its own syntax and takes time to become fluent in. Droke, after the county filing, had gone quiet. This was not entirely reassuring. Quiet with Silas Droke was not necessarily peaceful, but the weeks passed without incident, and in October, Frank Henderson rode over to tell them that he had heard from a reliable source that the county commissioner's office was reviewing Droke's informal grazing claims against several properties in the area, following a pattern of complaints that had finally accumulated to the point of official attention. This was significant. It meant Droke's method of pressure was losing its invisibility, and invisible pressure was the only kind that worked. "He will find another approach or he will leave you alone," Frank said. "Likely the latter." Droke is not brave. He is strategic. When the strategy is failing, he redirects. Hazel received this information with a nod and a cup of coffee for Frank and a private exchange of glances with Patrick that said several things without saying them. In November, with the first frost on the Hollow, Hazel told Patrick one evening by the fire, in the straightforward way she told him things, that she was expecting a child. He was quiet for a moment with the news, and then he was not quiet at all, and it was one of those moments that goes into the permanent record of a person's interior life, the ones that mark the before and the after. He took her hands. He said her name. He said nothing coherent for about 30 seconds, and she laughed at him with enormous warmth and said, "Breathe, Patrick." He breathed. He said, "When?" "June," she said. "Early June, I think." "A summer baby," he said. "A hollow baby," she said. He put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with everything he felt and did not attempt to moderate any of it. "I love you," he said, "completely. I want you to know that entirely." "I know it," she said. "I know it every day." She covered his hands with hers. "I love you too, you should know it." "I know it," he said, "every day." The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and long, and they were warm and together. They had laid in everything carefully, firewood stacked deep against the west wall of the cabin, where the prevailing wind could not touch it. Food preserved and stored in the root cellar they had dug in October. The horses comfortable in the new stable that Patrick and Creed had built before the first freeze. The chickens inside their insulated coop with their philosophical equanimity about the season. The ranch operated through winter on its own rhythm, and Reuben managed the daily things with increasing confidence, while Patrick was home by the fire more evenings than he would have been in any previous winter of his life. They read to each other in the evenings, taking turns with the books Hazel had in her trunk, a battered collection that she had carried in the wagon alongside her practical supplies, because she had never considered books anything other than essential. He read aloud slowly and well. She listened with her eyes sometimes closed and her hands in her lap, and he watched her face over the top of the page, and thought that this was the complete thing, the whole of what he had not known he was missing, until she had made it impossible not to know. January brought a bad blizzard that kept them inside for 3 days with only the animals to attend to in the brief windows between storm bands. On the second day of the blizzard, Patrick taught Hazel to play chess on a set Creed had carved from pine and given them as a wedding gift with uncharacteristic sentimentality. She learned the rules in 30 minutes and beat him the following morning, which she did not gloat about and he did not concede graciously, and they replayed the final sequence twice while she demonstrated, patiently and with perfect accuracy, where he had gone wrong. "You saw it 4 moves ahead," he said. "3," she said. "I was guessing on the 4th. You were right." "I usually am," she said, without arrogance, as a statement of fact about her own reasoning processes, and he laughed so hard he nearly knocked the board over. Spring came in the particular way of Kansas springs, which do not ease in but arrive, suddenly, with the smell of wet earth and the sound of water in the creek bed, real water, seasonal and brief but real. And the hollow justified its name in the best possible sense, becoming a bowl of new green with the cottonwoods leafing out and the prairie grasses pushing up through last year's dry standing stalks. Hazel planted her second kitchen garden, larger this time, with additions she had been planning through the winter in her farm journal. She planted a section of medicinal herbs along the south wall of the cabin that she had learned about from Ada, who had learned about them from her own mother, practical medicine for practical women, in a place where the nearest doctor was 40 miles away. In April, Creed appeared at the hollow with an expression that was not quite his usual deliberate blankness. He held his hat in his hands. He said carefully that he had an opportunity. His brother in Colorado needed a partner on a new cattle operation and had written to offer him a share if he would come. He said he felt he should say it directly because he had a lot of respect for both of them. Patrick listened to this and felt the loss of it even while he understood it completely. Creed had been with him for 6 years. He was not easily replaced. He was, in his quiet way, a considerable man. "You should go," Patrick said. Creed nodded once. "I will write you a letter of reference," Hazel said, because she was also at the table, "though I suspect your work speaks for itself. You are the finest builder I have seen, and I grew up watching my father put up a barn." Creed looked at her with something that might have been the warmest expression his face was capable of. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Warren." He nodded again, put on his hat, and that was essentially that. Reuben took the news of Creed's departure with the drama of the young, convinced that the ranch would not function without him, and then spent the following 2 weeks demonstrating that it would by working himself into a state of responsible exhaustion that Patrick had to actively manage. They hired a second hand in May, a quiet man of about 30 named Samuel who came with good references from 2 ranches north of Ellsworth and who integrated into the operation with minimal disruption. The baby arrived in early June, exactly as Hazel had predicted, in a quick and purposeful labor that lasted 7 hours and concluded at 4 in the morning with the kind of clarity that birth brings. The whole world suddenly organized around a single new fact. Ada was present, because she had appointed herself present and they had not disagreed with this, and the Dust Creek midwife, Mrs. Calder, who managed the proceedings with the professionalism of someone who had done this 400 times and intended to keep doing it. Patrick was in the main room, where Ada had put him with a cup of coffee and a firm suggestion about staying out of the way, and he heard the first sound the baby made, a short, announcing cry, offended at the interruption, and felt his whole life rearrange itself again. Ada appeared in the doorway. "A boy," she said. "Healthy, both fine." He went in. Hazel was propped against the pillows, with the particular exhausted serenity of someone who has done something enormous and is processing it. She held the baby against her chest, a solid, red-faced, dark-haired creature who was apparently already in the process of adjusting to the situation and finding it acceptable. "Hello," Patrick said to both of them and could not say anything else for a moment. "He has your nose," Hazel said. Patrick sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and his wife and could not have reconstructed a coherent sentence if someone had demanded one. He put his hand very gently on the baby's back, feeling the impossible aliveness of it, the warmth and the breath. "What is his name?" he said when he could say something. "I thought Thomas," she said quietly. For his father, if you agree." He looked at her. "I agree," he said. "Completely." They named him Thomas James Warren Thomas for her first husband, James for Patrick's father, and he arrived in the hollow with the same thoroughgoing intention that his mother had shown when she first rode into Dusk Creek, making his presence known without apology and immediately reorganizing everything around himself. The summer of 1879 was the busiest Patrick Warren had known, which was considerable because he had built a ranch from nothing. Thomas Warren, named with love for two men who had shaped his parents' lives, slept in a cradle that Patrick had built from cedar wood over 3 winter evenings, working from a pattern in a book that Hazel had procured from somewhere and annotated in the margins with her characteristic precision. He was a good baby in the way that certain babies seem to understand the logistics of the people around them and adjust accordingly, sleeping in substantial blocks and eating enthusiastically, and looking at the world with wide gray eyes that were unmistakably Patrick's. Hazel nursed and managed the hollow and wrote in her farm journal, and told Patrick about her days with a detail that made him feel that nothing in them was wasted or unremarkable, and he told her about his with the same commitment, because that was the thing. They had both known it. Telling the other person about the day was the whole of what a life together was, the daily offering of the small and large facts of being alive, received and valued by someone who had chosen to be there. Droke had, as Frank Henderson predicted, redirected. In August, word came from Ellsworth that his informal grazing claims had been formally reviewed and denied by the county commissioner's office in a letter that, by all accounts, had been diplomatically worded but absolutely clear. He had accepted this with the calculated pragmatism of a man who knew when a position was untenable and moved to the next one. He had other land and other ambitions, and the drover's hollow parcel was no longer worth the political cost. Hazel received this news with a nod and wrote it in her farm journal with the date and the outcome and a brief note on the county process, because she kept records of everything. Patrick thought she might say something expansive about it, something that acknowledged the months of pressure and the effort of holding it. She said, "Good. Now the water access is fully settled and I can plan the irrigation extension." He loved her so profoundly in that moment that he had to turn away to hide the expression on his face. October brought the second anniversary of the day Hazel had ridden into Dusk Creek with her folded claim in her morning dress pocket. She did not mark this explicitly, but he knew the date because he had looked up the filing date in the county records once, in the spring, because he wanted to know the precise origin point of everything. He made dinner that evening, with a competence he had been developing over the better part of a year, and which Hazel received with the gracious honesty of someone who could tell when things were improving, and Thomas sat in his chair at the table corner and managed a biscuit with great seriousness. After dinner, after Thomas was sleeping, they sat on the south porch in the October dark, which was cold enough for coats but not yet for retreat, and Hazel leaned back against Patrick's shoulder the way she had learned to sit in the evenings, comfortably and without ceremony, and they looked out at the hollow. 2 years, she said. Almost, he said. 2 years since you filed. People still call it the cursed land, she said. I heard Mrs. Pettibone at the store last week. What did you say? I told her it produces the finest beans I have grown in 30 years of knowing beans, she said, and that the well has not gone dry in the drought year of 1874 or any other year, and that the soil composition on the upper acreage is exceptional for high grass cultivation, and that curses are a story people tell about land they want and cannot have. He put his arm around her. What did she say? She bought a jar of my preserved squash. He laughed. She laughed. The Kansas night was full of stars and the sound of the creek moving through the hollow's bottom, because even in October there was a little water still, the last of the seasonal flow, and it caught the moonlight in the way that moving water does. We built something real, she said. We did, he said. You came to warn me, she said. You rode over to tell me about Droke and the fence line and the curse. I came to warn you, he agreed. And then you helped me work it, she said. He held her closer. You were already working it, he said. I just stayed. Yes, she said. You stayed. She tilted her head up to look at him in the dark. That is the better story, not the warning. The staying. He kissed her, there on the south porch with the cottonwoods in the dark and the creek below, and the sleeping baby inside and the whole of the hollow around them. And it was warm and real, and said everything that had already been said and would keep being said in the daily language of their shared life. In the spring of 1881, Hazel expanded the hollow's acreage by purchasing the 12 acres on the western edge that had been released from a lapsed claim, bringing the property to an even 112 acres. She financed this with the proceeds from 2 seasons of successful bean and squash production sold to the Dusk Creek General Store, and through a credit arrangement that she negotiated so precisely that Pruitt later told his wife he was not entirely sure how he had ended up on the favorable end of it. She filed the new acreage in her own name. Patrick, who had been consulted because they consulted each other about everything that affected the hollow and the ranch, agreed that this was correct. The hollow was hers in the original and specific sense. She had seen it and decided and done the work, and the expansion of it belonged to that same lineage of decision. Their second child, a girl they named Clara after Patrick's mother, arrived in the autumn of 1881 with less urgency and more ceremony than Thomas had, taking her time in a 12-hour labor that Mrs. Calder managed with equanimity and Ada attended with excited tears. Clara was dark-eyed and golden-haired, and had, from approximately her first week, an expression of deep personal agenda that Hazel recognized with both amusement and something like recognition. Thomas, who was 2 and already forming opinions about everything, regarded his sister with the cautious interest of someone who has been informed of a change in the arrangements and is reserving judgment. Reuben, by this time, had developed from the enthusiastic young hand of the Hollow's early days into a genuinely skilled cattleman who had taken over day-to-day management of the Double Creek's northern acreage, with an independence that Patrick acknowledged with a formal raise in wages and Hazel acknowledged with a significant improvement in the quality of the meals that appeared when Reuben ate at their table, which was most Sunday evenings. Samuel had proven over 2 years to be exactly what his references had suggested: steady, skilled, and the kind of person who makes an operation function through unglamorous consistency. He had also, in a development that nobody had exactly predicted, begun a courtship of the Caldwell family's eldest daughter, Annie, which was conducted with an agonized formality that Hazel found touching and Patrick found entertainingly familiar. "He reminds me of someone," Hazel said, watching Samuel carefully hand Annie Caldwell down from a wagon at the church social in the summer of 1882 with the concentrated attention of a man who is very aware of being observed. "Does he?" Patrick said. "He does," she said, with the smile that had started as an almost smile in the spring of 1878 and had become, over 4 years, the particular smile that was only for him warm and private and entirely certain. By the end of 1882, the Drover's Hollow was known throughout the county not as the Cursed Land but as the Warren Place, which Hazel accepted because it was their name together, and she had chosen that, though she retained in her farm journal, which she had continued without interruption since the first day she had arrived, the original designation, Drover's Hollow, because history deserved its accurate name. She also retained in the journal's first entry a note she had made before she had filed the claim, a list of the hollow's assets: limestone well, 3 standing walls, seasonal creek, eastern exposure, good soil composition. At the bottom of the list underlined she had written, "sufficient." She had been right about that, as she generally was. The county commissioner's office in the spring of 1883 published a new county survey map that included, for the first time, formal notation of the hollow's water access provisions as a model for how such provisions should be recorded in future claims. It was a small administrative thing, and most people did not notice it. Hazel noticed it. She cut the relevant section from the newspaper that printed the commissioner's notice and glued it into her farm journal with the date and a single word. Good. Thomas Warren grew through his early years with the straightforward energy of a boy raised in open country, learning to ride at 3 and to help with morning feeding at 4, and to read at 5 with the focus and speed that suggested his mother's particular relationship with books. He had Patrick's gray eyes and Hazel's green-eyed steadiness in his character, which was a good combination, and he asked questions about everything with an appetite that his parents did their combined best to feed. Clara, at 2, had already established herself as someone whose opinion of any given situation would be made known through whatever means proved most effective, which could range from an extremely expressive silence to a volume and persistence that had no precedent in either parent's personality, and which Ada, delighted, attributed to some ancestral source that was not further specified. In the evenings, when the children were sleeping and the hollow was quiet, Hazel and Patrick sat on the south porch or by the fire depending on the season, and she told him about the day and he told her about the day. And this was the practice that had not varied since the first evenings by the fire in the hollow's first spring, when he had stayed later than he had meant to and she had let him, because the day needed telling and there was finally someone to tell it to. He thought sometimes about the Thursday in 1878 when he had heard, at the feed store, about the widow and the cursed land, and the impulse that had sent him to the land office, and then east through the cottonwoods with the story about the fence line. He thought about arriving to find her on the roof of a 3-walled cabin, nailing down a frame, not startled, not frightened, simply looking down at him, and finishing the nail she had been holding before the interruption. He thought about the 40 miles to Ellsworth in the morning light, and the fire in June, and the west-facing doorway and the 2 old cottonwoods, and the first sound his son had made in the dark of an early June morning, and the specific weight and warmth of his daughter in his arms when Mrs. Calder had handed her over. He thought that he had come to warn her and had ended up working the land beside her, and this was the truest thing about his life. Not any single decision or moment, but the accumulation of them, the staying, the showing up every morning to the thing they had built together. In the autumn of 1883, Hazel put down her farm journal one evening and said, "I want to expand the upper acreage. I want to fence it properly and run sheep." He looked at her across the fire. "Sheep," he said. "The wool market in Ellsworth is good," she said, "and the upper acreage grass composition is better suited to sheep than to cattle. I have been reading about it." She indicated the book she had been using as a reference, which had been borrowed from the Ellsworth Lending Library and had its spine nearly cracked from how many times she had consulted it. "The fencing investment is the main obstacle, but I have numbers." She opened the farm journal. She had numbers. They talked for 2 hours about the economics and the logistics and the particular fence design that would be required. And by the end of it, they had a plan, because they always ended up with a plan, which was one of the many fine qualities of 2 people thinking about something together who trust each other's reasoning and understand each other's priorities. The sheep arrived in the spring of 1884. A small initial flock of 20 ewes purchased from a rancher in the county to the north, who had reduced his herd for reasons of his own, and they installed themselves in the upper acreage with an air of animals who had been going somewhere, and had not expected to arrive somewhere this adequate. By summer there were lambs. By autumn, Hazel had delivered the first drover's hollow wool to the Ellsworth market, and received a price that was exactly what she had calculated it would be, which she noted in the farm journal without the word "I told you so," because she was not that kind of person, but with a satisfaction in the numbers that communicated everything. Thomas, at 5, had opinions about the sheep. He expressed them freely. Clara, at 3, had befriended the oldest ewe in the way of very small children with very large animals, through a combination of fearlessness and the offering of appropriate snacks, and followed the ewe around the upper acreage on Saturday mornings while Hazel worked nearby. The two of them engaged in what appeared to be a sustained and mutually agreeable conversation. Patrick watched his family on those Saturday mornings, his son at the fence debating the relative merits of sheep versus cattle, with the serious intensity of someone who had done a great deal of research on the subject, which he had, because he was his mother's child. His daughter and the old ewe moving through the autumn grass in their companionable circuit. Hazel checking the flock with the experienced eye of someone who had been doing this for 18 months and knew each animal individually, and felt the particular abundance of a life that contained more than he had known to want. The Drover's Hollow had been, for the three families before Hazel, a place where things went wrong in ways that accumulated into departure. It was a real estate of bad fortune, or so the story went, though the story left out the specific facts of Silas Droke's pressure campaigns and the unrecorded water access filings, and the practical deficiencies that were deficiencies of documentation and knowledge rather than of the land itself. The land was good. It had always been good. It had a limestone well that did not go dry, and a seasonal creek that kept the creek bed pasture green longer than the surrounding country, and an upper acreage with exceptional grass composition, and an eastern exposure that gave the kitchen garden adequate light, and a southern-facing porch that caught the afternoon warmth through 8 months of the year. It had needed someone who knew to ask about the creek access separately. It had needed someone who obtained a letter from the commissioner's office before she filed. It had needed someone who checked the survey stakes first thing and measured the fence boards before asking anyone else to cut them. It had needed Hazel Barrett, with her 30 years of farming knowledge and her father's conviction about the importance of reading everything carefully, and her particular kind of stubbornness that was not stubbornness at all but precision. The precise knowledge of what she was and what she could do and what she had decided. And it had needed Patrick Warren, who rode over to warn her and ended up staying because some part of him recognized, from the moment she finished the nail before looking down at him, that here was the specific kind of life he had been building toward without knowing the destination. On a September morning in 1884, with the cottonwoods at the hollow's entrance already beginning to turn, Hazel sat at her kitchen table in the early light before the children woke and Patrick had come in from the morning feeding, and she opened her farm journal to the first entry, the one she had made before she had filed the claim, the list of assets with sufficient underlined at the bottom. She read it. She turned to the current page and wrote the date and then wrote, Season 6. Thomas and Clara Well, Upper Flock, 28 ewes, 12 lambs retained for spring expansion. Kitchen garden final harvest estimated at the largest yet. The eastern fence remains sound. The well has not gone dry. She paused. She listened to the sounds of the hollow in the morning, the horses in the stable, the chickens making their daily complaints about the light, the distant bell that one of the upper acreage ewes wore and which moved through the morning air like a small regular announcement of the flock's location. She heard Patrick's boots on the porch steps, the particular sound of him coming in from outside, which she knew as well as her own breath. She wrote one more line in the farm journal. She wrote, Patrick says the lower pasture grass will be ready to turn over by October. He is usually right about these things, which I find I do not mind at all. She closed the journal. Patrick came through the door with the cold of the September morning still on him and went directly to the coffee pot on the stove, which she had put on before she sat down at the table, because she knew when he would be back in, roughly, and she understood the logic of having the coffee ready. He poured a cup, came to the table, sat down across from her and looked at her over the steam in the morning light. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. He looked out the window at the hollow coming into the day, the grass still silver with dew, the cottonwoods luminous in the early light, the sheep on the upper acreage moving in their unhurried way through the morning, the whole of it real and worked in theirs. Then he looked back at her, and she looked back at him, And it was the same thing it had always been, the day beginning, the other person there. The whole of what a life together was, practiced and chosen and ongoing. "Tell me what you are planning for the lower pasture," he said. "I was about to ask you the same thing," she said. He smiled at her. She smiled back. And outside the window, the hollow that everyone had said was cursed went about its business in the golden September morning, very much alive, very much enough, and full of the ordinary, extraordinary fact of two people who had found each other in it and decided to stay.